Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.42, Crossing the Delaware. As 1776 drew to a close, George Washington and the Continental Army were looking at a bleak situation. The war was not going well for them. Over the past several months, the American army had been chased from New York, through New Jersey, and was now stuck in Pennsylvania, across the Delaware River from Trenton. December, however, would not mark the American army limping into winter quarters, but would rather see Washington make one final attempt to salvage something, anything, from the year's campaign. Today, we are going to spend our time moving through that December and everything that went down as we wrap up 1776. The early weeks of December were filled with a mixture of confusion and apprehension for George Washington. On the one hand, it would have been impossible for him not to ruminate on just how rough the fall had been. He was dealing with all of those same problems that had plagued him throughout the war thus far. December was wrapping up, and Washington's already outnumbered army risked almost completely evaporating at the end of December when enlistments ran out. Yet as Washington looked at his army trying to figure out how to survive the fight another year, he was also having to deal with one of his officers who was conspicuously absent. Washington had written to Charles Lee, letting him know that he could really use him and his 5,000 troops that were back at Newcastle. Washington had needed to leave Lee behind at the time because he really did not know where Howe was going to strike. We know now that Fort Washington was the target, but had Washington moved all of his forces into New Jersey, it would have risked leaving the British a far easier path right back into New England. The solution, as we know, was to leave Lee and those 5,500 men behind, while Washington moved south into New Jersey. However, before he had left Newcastle, he had told Lee that should Howe move all the British troops into New Jersey, Lee was to take his army and rendezvous with Washington. The British did move the majority of their army into New Jersey, and yet Charles Lee, much to Washington's very considerable anger, remained rooted in place. Although Washington did not order Lee to join up with him, he very much expected it. Now, already Charles Lee and George Washington were in a tense spot. Washington had become aware that Lee had lost faith in him as the commander-in-chief, and he seemed to be making at least some overtures towards taking over that job for himself. By December 4th, Washington had an eyebrow raised as to why General Lee was ghosting him, writing to John Hancock that he had not heard a word from Lee since the 26th of the previous month. A curious surprise, considering that Washington was now sending him daily dispatches. Washington wrote to Hancock again on December 8th, still completely in the dark as to where Lee was. As it turned out, Lee was moving towards Washington. However, he was doing so at a snail's pace. Lee was himself planning a daring attack. Rather than moving directly to Washington, he was planning to move through New Jersey, trying to catch up at the rear of the British column. As Washington biographer John Fairley explains, this plan was not without some logic. If Lee could catch up to the rear of the British army, it might be enough to get them to stop their pursuit of Washington's army. As it would turn out, Washington was not about to get the chance to discuss with Lee what had taken him so long. On December 13th, Lee decided that he had earned himself a hotel room for the night, and had traveled along with 15 others to a tavern in Baskin Ridge. The British got tipped off to the high-value target and sent a force of 25 men to capture Lee. That is exactly what happened. Charles Lee was captured by the British. Based on his writings, it looks like Washington learned of the capture of Lee on December 15th, from a letter sent from John Sullivan. On that day, Washington wrote to Hancock discussing the fate of Lee and what it meant for the war moving forward. Washington and Lee might have had their differences, but this does not change the fact that a senior commander in Washington's army was now a British prisoner. It was not a welcome development. With few other options available, Washington promoted General Sullivan to take over Lee's position. Now, if we are talking about a guy who has had a very busy year, we must look at John Sullivan. After botching, pretty much everything in Canada, Sullivan found himself in New York, where he was captured during the Battle of Long Island. Then, the Howe brothers sent Sullivan to Congress to encourage them to come to a peaceful resolution, which led to that meeting with the Howes in New York. Now, with the capture of Charles Lee, Sullivan found himself getting an unexpected promotion. The capture of Charles Lee was another blow to Washington in a season full of blows. If there was any kind of a silver lining, however, it came from General Howe himself, when he decided that he was not going to wait for the Delaware to freeze over, and was going to enter winter quarters. Washington had nervously been waiting for the river to freeze, as the Americans fully believed that as soon as it was possible, Howe would move on Pennsylvania, and more specifically, the capital in Philadelphia. Although Howe was not going to invade Philadelphia in 1776, the threat of such an invasion had taken a very heavy toll on the city. Following writing Common Sense a year earlier, Thomas Paine now found himself tagging along with the army as an aide-de-camp of Nathanael Greene. Paine could see their struggles firsthand and seemed to acutely understand the daunting task in front of Washington. In response to this suffering, he wrote The American Crisis. The pamphlet opened with the now famous line, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. Be he who stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Even as Paine penned the piece, he witnessed the effect that the war was having on the average citizen. As he returned to Philadelphia to get the pamphlet printed, he found a Philadelphia that had largely been abandoned. Seeing people running from what they anticipated to be an approaching British army illustrated to Paine, possibly more than anything else could, just how desperate the situation had become. As had Common Sense at the beginning of the year, here again we see the powerful effect that Paine's words had on the men. As the work circulated, the men out in the cold doing the fighting took those words to heart and took it almost as a rallying cry, as it breathed a much-needed resolve into a group that had long been on the run. This was coming together at a moment of particular despair in the American camp. As discussed, 1776 had been a mess. Howe had made an offer of amnesty in New Jersey to those who had taken oath of loyalty, and much to Washington's displeasure, several thousand people took up the opportunity. Despite George Washington's annoyance, it is also unfair to say that everybody in New Jersey simply rolled over upon the arrival of the British. Although a number of people did exactly that. As it would turn out, there were plenty of New Jersey farmers who really did not seem to enjoy the British presence and did not waste their opportunity to harass the army. Some of this harassment came through the actual Continental Army. However, a large amount of it came from local militias as well. Not that the British or the Hessians had done anything to endear themselves to the Americans. They needed to resupply, and despite attempts by New Jersey Commander James Grant to limit the troops from outright plundering is largely what took place. Howe, and really nobody at all, was a huge fan of Grant. He seemingly looked down on just about everybody around him, and more concerningly, was not exactly great at his job. We have indeed seen James Grant more than once in this podcast very nearly blow entire operations. The problem is that James Grant was well connected back in London, so Howe was stuck with him. However, he wisely decided to do a lot of the heavy lifting of the command. Howe had stretched his army out along the Delaware River, with the Hessians, under the command of Johann Rall, being placed in Trenton, the weakest part of the line. Although Howe was taking some risk by stretching his line over such a long distance, he had made the assumption that with winter coming, the Americans were also done. He certainly was not planning any more offensive operations. He just wanted to make sure that the Americans stayed exactly where they were. The problem was that because the British were spread so thinly, it made them easy targets for the Americans. These attacks never did much damage, but really that was not the point. If anything, this was similar to the harassment that we have seen from the Native Americans along the frontier throughout much of this podcast. Quick strikes that do some damage, but never anything more akin to an actual engagement. The entire situation, however, was exhausting for those along the Delaware, who were constantly looking over their shoulders for American ambushes that they knew were coming and that they could seemingly do little about. Critically, during this time there was at least some concern that the Americans could target Trenton, as Rall was repeatedly encouraged to fortify the town. Rall, seemingly dismissing the American army, just blew off the recommendations, something that he would come to regret. If you're wondering how Grant responded to the ongoing harassment, he all but completely dismissed it. Rall wrote frequently to Grant, telling him of the conditions along the frontier, to which Grant complained about the Germans' exaggeration. Grant assured Rall that Washington and the Americans were not going to do something crazy, like, I don't know, cross the Delaware and attack, and that he just needed to chill out. Although Washington likely was not complaining too much about the continued harassment of the Hessians, he was also keenly aware of just how poorly the year had gone for him. Washington had faced criticism for his handling of the war, and, if not outright, there certainly were hushed whispers discussing what replacing Washington might look like. These small raids were good, but they were never going to do much more than annoy the British. If Washington was going to act, if he was going to do something to try and turn the tide, this was an ideal moment. He knew that his army could well evaporate at the end of the year when enlistments expired. After a year of loss after loss, it would be a sweet victory to win a battle and, hopefully, convince some of the men that sticking around was not a fool's errand. Furthermore, Washington believed that the British Army might be taking for granted that the Americans were fighting a primarily defensive war, and that they were thus unwilling to launch an offensive campaign if the proper moment struck. What Washington saw was an enemy that he could take by surprise, and this is exactly what he set out to do. The plan that Washington came up with was a strike against the Hessians at Trenton. Washington's plan for this battle was anything but a straightforward assault. John Fairlane writes that at the same time that Washington was busy complaining about a lack of good soldiers and the inability of the militia, he was busy coming up with a complex plan when there were much easier options at his disposal. On Christmas Day, Washington got to work, dividing his army into 3 parts. He sent one group of New Jersey and Pennsylvania militia with James Ewing and had them set up directly across the Delaware from Trenton. A second group under John Cadwalader moved downriver, taking up a position to the south of Trenton. Washington himself took 2,400 Continental troops and moved to a position approximately 9 miles north of Trenton. The plan was that upon nightfall, everybody would begin the process of crossing the river, with the columns all converging on Trenton at around 5 a.m. Although today the crossing is a moment that is seen as legendary, in reality it was anything but. Everybody was late crossing the river. A winter storm had rolled in, causing temperatures to plunge, as rain and hail came crashing down upon the men making the crossing. The plan had called for everybody to be across the river by midnight. However, it was 4 a.m. before everybody had made it across. Washington desperately had wanted that element of surprise, of striking the Hessians while they were asleep. Now, however, he was 9 miles north of the town, in the middle of a brutal storm, and had a 9-mile march to reach his objective, an objective that he was supposed to be at in an hour. Washington at least flirted with the idea of calling it a day and just canceling the entire thing altogether. However, he worried that at this point doing that would expose his men just as much as if he pushed forward with the attack. Now, recall that to this point, we had 3 columns moving towards Trenton, and we will talk about the other 2 groups here in a moment. As it turned out, Washington still had 1 more column planned, as John Sullivan broke off from Washington's group and took a group towards the north of Trenton to block the Hessians from escaping. Washington and Nathanael Greene continued along their path. The plan was that Washington and Sullivan would block the Hessians from fleeing, while Ewing and his men slammed into them from the south. The men to the south of Trenton under Cadwalader would attack in Bordertown and tie up any reinforcements that might attempt to bail out Trenton. It was a complicated plan to be sure, but if successful, it would not only catch the Hessians by surprise, but it would essentially trap them inside of Trenton and put them at the mercy of the American army. The only problem is that as Washington and company approached Trenton at around 8 a.m., several hours later than planned, Ewing was nowhere to be seen. Cadwalader, likewise, was not in Bordertown, distracting anybody. The reason for all this, you ask? Is because Washington is the only person who actually had made the crossing. Despite the late arrival, and the failure of 2 of his other columns to even cross the river, Washington did have a few things going for him. Although by now it was well past sunrise, the storm had managed to keep everything dark, thus helping maintain his element of surprise. Rawle had been aware that the Americans might be up to something. Conveniently for the Americans, though, a group of approximately 50 Virginia militia members, acting without orders, had struck at the outskirts of Trenton. This was not really that unusual. As we had talked about earlier today, the Americans had been busy for weeks harassing the Hessians. Upon coming across this group of Virginians on the march towards Trenton, Washington was incensed, believing that they had given up the Americans' element of surprise. Although it is hard to blame Washington's anger here, as it turns out, this worked really well for the Continental Army. You see, Rawle had been expecting the Americans to try something. And they did. Those 50 or so Virginia militia members attacked. They were repulsed. Rawle fully believed that was the thing that he was preparing for. With the Virginians repulsed, the weather growing worse, the pressure of the last several weeks, and, of course, the fact that it was Christmas, Rawle went ahead and let his men move inside to get warm, canceling the otherwise standard patrols. At around 8 a.m., the Americans finally made first contact with a group of Hessian sentries, but really it was already too late. Despite sounding the alarm, most of the men in Trenton were still sound asleep, only to be rudely awakened by the sound of the American guns. The Germans tried to escape over that bridge that should have been blocked by Ewing. However, only a small handful managed to get out before Sullivan swung around and filled the gap. The Hessians did manage to get some cannon in place, and indeed did get a few shots off before the Americans were able to drive the Hessians off and capture the heavy guns. During that encounter, the American army did take a handful of casualties. Among the wounded was an 18-year-old college student from Virginia. This young man, named James Monroe, was one of only a handful of Americans injured that day in Trenton. Having been shot in the shoulder, Monroe was seriously injured, as the bullet severed an artery, causing him to very nearly bleed to death. The only reason he claims that he did not die that day in Trenton is because of the quick work of a doctor who managed to clamp the bleeding, thus saving the young man's life. If you are curious about what's going to happen to James Monroe, well, I've got a sneaking suspicion that we might see him again in our future. The battle was over quickly. Rawle had done what he could to try and rally his men, and even briefly tried to turn the offensive. Unfortunately for Rall, who had been told by Grant that he was exaggerating the danger, he was shot and killed in the chaos of the battle. With Rall now dead, things quickly began to wrap up, and the regiments began surrendering. One group attempted to flee across the river, only to get bogged down in the cold water, where the Americans could easily pick them off. At the end of the day, the Americans had lost 6 men, with another 5, James Monroe included, injured. The Germans saw 20 dead and over 900 captured. With the Americans now celebrating a much-needed victory by pilfering the Germans' liquor supplies, Washington decided that they had all done enough for one day and pulled everybody back across the Delaware. For the Americans, the victory at Trenton was a much-needed win, after a year that had seen the army struggle to find any footing. Sure, it was not a victory that was going to turn the war, nor did it mark a new, more aggressive phase in the American war. This was still going to be a war of posts. However, the victory at Trenton gave Washington something to hang his hat on before retiring to winter quarters. Except George Washington was not quite ready to retire to winter quarters. Now, I had said at the outset today that we would be wrapping up 1776, but, well, I lied. There is a bit more to our story here today, so we are going to move on into early 1777. If you will recall, there had originally been 3 columns set across the Delaware on Christmas night, with Ewing and Cadwalader failing to ever get across. Living up to the mantra of better late than never, Cadwalader and Ewing would eventually make their way across the Delaware, a day or so late. When they got there, they discovered that the Hessians, rather than regrouping at Bordertown, had pulled all the way back up to Princeton. Washington, seeing an opportunity to inflict even more damage, crossed back over the Delaware into New Jersey on December 31st. Washington had actually managed to convince people to hang around just a little longer, which was no small feat. Washington accomplished this through a mixture of pleading with the men and giving them an extra $10 to stick around. Unsurprisingly, the British were not exactly thrilled over what had happened at Trenton. To counter this, Lord Cornwallis, along with some 8,000 men, decided to move south from Princeton to Trenton, where Washington's army was still hanging out down around the Delaware. Now, this put Washington and the Continental Army into a tough spot. Washington was outnumbered, although not by huge margins, he himself at 6,800 men. However, with Cornwallis now moving on Trenton, Washington lacked the time necessary to pull his men back across the Delaware to the relative safety of Pennsylvania. Leaving on January 2nd, Cornwallis did not enjoy a light march. Washington had sent a contingent of Americans forward to harass the column on its march towards Trenton. Conditions from the recent storms had turned the roads into a muddy mess, further slowing down the British advance. What makes less sense, however, is why Washington remained where he did. With the Delaware to his back, Washington hemmed himself into a position with limited mobility. Should the British reach him, he risked being trapped along the banks of the river. John Fairling theorizes that Washington may have been planning to make a stand here, and that he had simply made an error in judgment. Either way, it seems that Washington realized just how precarious his position was, and that getting trapped with the Delaware to his back was probably not where he wanted to be. Cornwallis, evidently figuring out what Washington did, wasted no time upon his arrival, and immediately sent men forward to engage. The Americans, however, stood their ground, not once but rather 3 times, as Cornwallis's men kept coming. By the time that Cornwallis had started his attack, it was already the evening hours, and daylight was fading. The Americans had stood their ground. Now, to be clear, these were not massive engagements or anything of the such. The bulk of Cornwallis's army was back in Trenton. However, the Americans survived the encounter. With darkness now falling, Cornwallis decided to call it a night and remain in Trenton. he could deal with Washington in the morning. If there is one thing that can be said about George Washington, it is that he was an absolute master at the coordinated withdrawal. As the British slept, Washington pulled his army way around the left flank of the British towards the north, with the plan being to swing around and slip in behind Cornwallis. His options were admittedly limited. Although the skirmishes that day had gone well, he must have been aware that it was only a matter of time before Cornwallis broke through. Furthermore, slipping back across the Delaware was not exactly going to be a simple task. So, instead, Washington swung around and decided to leave Cornwallis to his rear. Cornwallis had no idea that Washington had left until the next morning, as Washington had left behind a handful of guys to make a whole lot of noise, keep the fires burning, and generally just make it look like somebody was still home. In fact, by the time that Cornwallis was figuring out that Washington had left, the Americans were approaching Princeton. As they neared Princeton, Washington, as he so liked to do, divided his army with the majority moving northeast under General Sullivan, and the remainder moving due north under the command of General Greene. Now, although Cornwallis and the majority of the men were down in Trenton scratching their heads at the missing American army, that is not to say that Princeton was just abandoned. 2 regiments remained in the town under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood. Mawhood was actually not planning to remain in Princeton long term, and in fact spotted the Americans as he and those 2 regiments marched towards the south to reinforce Trenton. Predictably, when Mawhood saw the American army, specifically the men being led by Nathanael Greene, he promptly confronted them. Quickly, a skirmish broke out between the Americans and the British. The British did gain an immediate advantage and pushed the Americans back, fatally wounding Hugh Mercer in the process. Mercer has been in our story for a while, though often not named. He was among the large number of people involved with this war who 2 decades earlier had been along for Braddock's March, a battle where he was wounded and very nearly died. Despite the loss of Mercer and the initial struggles, the Americans did manage to regroup, in no small part because Washington himself rode over to rally them, with Washington putting himself dangerously close to being a target. Along with Washington came reinforcements, and now it was Mawhood and the British who were outnumbered. Realizing their position, the British broke and fled. A single regiment remained inside of Princeton. However, they provided little assistance as they were quickly driven from the town, or captured in the process of trying to get away. For Washington, the ultimate goal would have been New Brunswick, where the British maintained a major supply depot. Although true that capturing, or destroying the depot would have been a welcome moment for Washington, he proved keenly able to read the situation. His army had scored several much-needed victories from the British in the past several weeks. From Trenton to avoiding Cornwallis, and now to the capture of Princeton, the Americans had dealt the British several heavy blows. Although seizing the supply depot in New Brunswick would have been, by far, the biggest victory of the bunch, that was always going to prove to be a much more difficult goal for the Americans. Winter was upon them. The temperature was dropping, and weeks of action had everybody exhausted. This is to say nothing of the fact that Washington still had Cornwallis to his rear, and was eager to avoid a full-scale engagement. Cornwallis, also understanding the importance of the supplies at Brunswick, had his army marching there directly from Trenton, to cut off any kind of American designs. By this point, Howe realized that he too needed to take a more defensive posture. He quickly ordered that the British troops pull out of Elizabethtown and retreat to Amboy. However, even as this retreat was taking place, American militia companies managed to catch up with the British and overrun them, taking more than 100 men prisoner. In the chaos of the British pullback through New Jersey, many of those loyalists whom had just accepted Howe's amnesty suddenly found themselves abandoned, and very much exposed and vulnerable to the approaching Americans, who had few sympathies for the Loyalists. Those who could abandoned their homes and raced to the safety of New York to avoid the vengeance of their countrymen. With British protection proving fickle, it would prove to seriously undermine future offers of amnesty by Howe. On January 8th, the Americans would score another victory, winning a skirmish at Hackensack, with the American George Clinton reporting that the British had abandoned the town with the utmost fright. With cold weather settling in, Washington made the decision to call it a year. His men were exhausted and needed time to rest and recuperate. Washington's army had ended a terrible year on a high note, and Washington realized that despite the present moment, it was time to pull back and let everybody catch their collective breath. On January 8th, the same day as Clinton's victory in Hackensack, Washington ordered his army to enter winter quarters at Morristown. What had essentially happened during those final weeks of 1776 and first weeks of 77 was that the Americans had managed to force the British out of New Jersey. Whereas at the beginning of December, the British controlled the state all the way to the south, to Trenton. By the time everybody slid into their winter quarters, the British hold was now down to just Amboy and Brunswick. It was a stunning turn of events for the Americans who had, since their victory in Boston nearly a year before, endured a repeated string of losses and retreats. Despite the decisions of the late summer to transform the war into a war of posts, that really had not worked out. There had been nothing resembling a second Bunker Hill during that fall. The Americans' most serious attempt to create a situation like Bunker Hill had come at Fort Washington, which, as we saw last time, was an unmitigated disaster. Although the Americans had been pushed out of New York and Canada, we should consider the accomplishments of 1776 as well. Politically, Congress moved at a glacial pace. However, it is no small accomplishment that they had declared independence. If there had been previously any lingering question as to the end goals of the war, Congress had made their intentions clear. This would likewise allow the Americans to begin opening up the process of attempting to establish diplomatic ties, something that we are going to begin looking at much more closely shortly. Of course, despite what Britain probably would have liked, the American Revolution was not occurring in a vacuum. The other European powers were not oblivious to what was going on across the Atlantic. Even if we are still not at a point where anybody was about to openly support the American cause, everybody knew that the Americans were going to come around looking for support, sooner rather than later. With this knowledge, those same countries were watching the war in America with a keen interest, as they were beginning to make those calculations of if supporting the American cause would benefit their own national interest. That string of victories at the end of the year for Washington did not escape the notice of potential allies in Europe. If there had been doubts about Washington previously, his victories to close the year in New Jersey proved to those powers that he was a capable military leader, rather than just some guy who happened to have a uniform and was playing general. There is still a ways to go before we get to formal alliances, but Washington had removed lingering doubts that those potential allies held about his military acumen. In London, the year was celebrated as being a huge success for the British. They had taken Canada and New York. They dealt the Americans a major loss at Fort Washington. However, through all of that patting on the back being done, men like Lord North realized that Washington's victories in New Jersey signified that the war could well be longer and, critically, more expensive than anybody had hoped. On the ground in America, the British officers spent a lot of time pointing the finger at one another for their losses to end the year. Everybody had their favorite scapegoat. Howe blamed the Germans, Henry Clinton blamed Cornwallis, and really the only thing that was consistent is that everybody was ready to blame everybody else for what had happened. The events in New Jersey also helped to convince General Howe that, as much as he would have hoped, the war was not going to conclude with some great battle. Although we should also remember that General Howe was never exactly confident about the ability of the British to actually win the war, and that he had written back in 1775 that defeating the Americans was going to be a very difficult, if not outright impossible, feat. As the 1776 campaign season came to a close, therefore, the only thing that appeared clear to everybody is that this war was far from over. Next time, we are going to take our story forward into 1777. The year would be filled with American efforts to slow the retreats of the previous year, while building on the momentum from Washington's string of victories in New Jersey. Until then, I hope you all have a fantastic 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as our story moves into 1777.